Everybody should be full of Apple Festival food by now. If you're not, you got one more chance today. Oh, well, it's hard to believe, but we are actually going to conclude the book of Genesis this morning. It's been a good series. I'll be honest, I actually don't know what's next, if we'll continue on or if we go on to something different. I need to talk to Pastor Cody about that. But as you remember, the last few weeks we've really looked at the life of Joseph. We saw him there, as many people say, in the pit, and we've seen him in Potiphar's house. We saw him in the palace there as his family come to him, talking about Jacob or Israel and the other brothers. Last week we looked at how he revealed himself to them and sent, and Jacob came down as well. And of course, the 7 years of famine was going on, and Jacob had bought and stored and then sold the corn. So now we've moved and transitioned out of that. There's a lot of things that can be said as we discussed it about Joseph and his life. Of course, he's a type of Christ, a beautiful picture of Christ. He also gives us some good stuff for daily living about proactiveness and just how he handled that situation there when that famine came, and then, the years of plenty and the years of famine. So now we've moved, this morning a transformation takes place, if you will. So we're going to start in chapter 49. We're going to jump around a little bit this morning. It's the lesson just kind of concludes out of Genesis and then starts in Exodus. But in Genesis chapter 49, it says, "And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." So now, just to skip ahead, because we do have a little bit of ground to cover, in verse 8, our lesson this morning was going to concentrate a little bit on Judah here. It says, "Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies, thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp from the prey, my son. Thou art gone up, he stooped down, he couched as a lion, as an old lion. Who shall rouse against him up? Rouse him up, there we go, excuse me. Who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be, binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine, and his teeth white with milk." So just starting there this morning, Jacob he's getting to the end of his life. We've seen that a lot over the last few weeks as we've closed chapters on other patriarchs' lives. And here, Jacob, or Israel, he has gathered his children in, and he's called them up one at a time, and we're not going to cover them all this morning. They start through the remainder of that or at the beginning of that chapter, and then come on through to Joseph. But here they're saying to Judah, it says, "Thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise." So he's saying, listen, all your brethren's going to give you praise. They're going to, you're going to be exalted, if you will. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. You're going to be a fighter. You're going to have military strength, if you will. Judah is a lion's whelp. It goes on down in the middle of that verse. In verse 9 it says, he couched as a lion and as an old lion. So lion, of course, many times, and most all the time, I guess, would be a picture of strength. we see that. Of course, even Satan's compared to a lion walking about, who he may devour. But here we're speaking of a lion in strength. The scepter in verse 10, talking about a king or an authority. Of course, our mind kind of goes there. We don't see much of that today, but we have been over in England now. So the king of an authority. And it goes on to say that, and it shall not depart. So if you look in verse 10, it says, the scepter shall not depart. So it's an extended reign. An extended reign. It gives a lot of key phrases throughout these few verses here. And then 11 and 12 is one of those things. This is not how we typically would talk today, obviously. But it says, the binding of his foal unto the vine of his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. Speaking of abundance, that he's going to have abundance. And verse 12, his eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk. So it's really referring there to abundance and health. So not only are his brethren going to praise him, not only is he going to have strength like a lion, not only is he going to have authority and be like a king, but he's going to have an extended reign. And, this is a pretty good blessing. You're going to have abundance of wealth and health. So, that's what you would dream of right there, and just in a blessing. That's about covers it all. Now, we see something similar to this later on in Scripture, and we can turn there this morning. We see it in Revelation, down in chapter number 5. We see a similarity here, and I've actually got it marked in my Bible as such. But the line of the tribe of Judah. So as you turn there, you can hold your place in Revelation. You can turn here, or I'll just read it for you. But, if you've never studied, and before we go to Revelation, we'll talk about this. But, a lot of times, and I'm the world's worst for it, when we study names and stuff in the Bible, skipping them because I can't really say them very good. But it is interesting when you look in the genealogy of Christ. There's a lot of great wealth and knowledge you can pull from that. And in the book of Matthew, and I remember when we studied some of these books of the Bible, and especially the 4 Gospels, it always stuck out to me of how they were portraying Jesus, and how the Gospels were focused on Jesus, how some of them was focused on his miracles, some of them was focused on him being a king, some of them was focused on him being, John focused on that Jesus is God, and that they're both the same. But in Matthew, it portrays Christ as king, and that shows his kingship. And it starts that out with his royal descent, if you will, in Matthew chapter number 1. It says, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So if you think back to where we started so many months ago in Genesis, it says, Abraham beget Isaac, and Isaac beget Jacob, and Jacob beget Judas and his brethren. So there we're seeing this tribe we're talking about, the tribe of Judah. So as you go on down, of course, then we get on into the genealogy, and it talks about Salmon beget Booz or Boaz of Rahab, and Booz or Boaz beget Obed of Ruth. And what a wonderful story that is. You're recognizing names there. And Obed beget Jesse, and Jesse beget David. And then the Bible tells you here something about David. It says David the king. So it makes sure it wants you to know who he's talking about here. Jesse beget David the king, and David the king beget Solomon of her that had been the wife of Urias. So then you start into another generation of people, 14 generations of a matter of fact, and then you get into the final generations of people, and it says in Jacob, talking about a different one now, beget Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So it lays out that royal descent, if you will, and that royal genealogy. Probably not in the last maybe 70 years, unless somebody was just curious about it, has anyone ever seen or probably Googled the royal descent that's going on right now. Probably that's been Googled more on, well, what's going to take place? Who's going to be next in the throne in England and all those things. And I mean, it's a neat thing when you see it because it's really laid out. And here the Bible lays it out for us as well. It's very clear. And then, of course, I think it's Luke that lays it out in the humanity side, back to his mother. But here we're going through to the king, King David, all the way back to Abraham and Isaac. And again, this covers what we've been talking about. And our major players are shown there this morning. So now where does Revelation tie into this? In chapter number 5, you see a lot of the same phrases used here that we just read about in Genesis this morning in chapter 49, verse 9 down through verse 10. So in Revelation 5, we see in verse 5, and one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. So we talked about that this morning in the book of Matthew, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent forth into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him that sat upon the throne. And when he had taken the book, and the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood, out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. So, we're not going to spend a lot of time right here this morning, but one thing that's interesting that I guess somebody told me one time that I wrote down in my Bible that, just kind of, it captivates us here about these different things. Some of this is a little hard to understand, but, when you first start this off, in verse 5 it says, Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. He's introduced as a lion. But then it says, verse 6, And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb. It's almost like, just put it down in Southwest Virginia terms for you and me this morning, that when, John kind of turned to see a lion, and in return, what he really saw was a lamb that had slain, in which we know that's Jesus. So I just, kind of to put that in terms, if you really think about the situation here, it's almost like he turned to see a lion. And of course, it was the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David. But in return, he really seen a lamb. And, those verses depict that well. So if we go back now, we go all the way back over to Genesis in chapter 49. So again, we see Jacob, or Israel's, prophecy here to his children, and particularly to Judah, that all these years later, that in Revelation we read that, we're going to even see that come to pass then as well. So again, you can link especially verse 9 and 10 over to Revelation 5 in that case. He goes on and blesses the children, and again, we've got a lot of stuff to cover. So he goes through and blesses Joseph as well. And then we get down to chapter 50 and verse number 1, And it says, and Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. So here's where I kind of want to take us back to where we've been the last few weeks. So again, and you all have studied the life of Joseph your whole life, and you know a lot about it. And, you know, it should be familiar in your mind because we just went through it. But, you know, it's very amazing because this is one of those stories in Scripture where we get the whole picture. We don't always get that in life. We don't always even maybe get that in the Bible. But in this case, we've gotten, by this point, we've gotten a pretty good picture that, you know, Jacob, which has now become Israel, has lived and had these children, and they've lived in Canaan, they've lived outside of Egypt, and then we've said the wonderful story about Joseph. And, you know, during the time, we've opened plays and different acts, and we've opened them back up, and man, we find Joseph in the pit and think, oh, how terrible that is. And we've seen the different ruses of his brothers, and then finally they sell him to the Ishmaelites, and we think, oh, this is going to be the end of him now. We're not going to hear him more. Then he gets sold down to Potiphar, and he's living his life there, and we see behind the scenes that the Lord's blessing him. And he's blessing Joseph, and Potiphar's house is getting blessed for his sake. And then we go on till Potiphar's wife cast her eyes on Joseph, and of course he leaves his coat and got him out, and she goes and tells a false story about him, and he winds up in prison. And down there he meets two interesting characters, our baker and our butler, and they have a dream. And of course y'all know that story. We've went over it, and they go back, and the baker was hanged and the butler was restored back to his duties. And then a period of time goes, I think a couple years, and Pharaoh dreams this dream, and nobody can interpret it, and it's important. And I think that was the first time I really linked you know, that crowd to what's happening in Exodus. That, you know, there was a time when these magicians and these astrologers, or whatever you want to call them, I mean, later on we call them witches and things, they could do this magic, but they couldn't interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And again, we talked about that in Egypt. There was a lot of things that the devil's crowd could duplicate, until Moses walked into camp that night with the lamb. And the same thing here, we see that all of a sudden God stopped that from happening, and the magicians couldn't do it, and he was distraught, Pharaoh was. So he said, you know, who's going to do this? And the butler remembered his faults that day and said, hey, there's a man down in prison, Joseph. He can interpret dreams. He told him the story. So Joseph, if you remember now, and I'm telling all this for a reason, because I think this is so important. This is where it ties everything together. Joseph goes, he cleans himself up, and he stands before Pharaoh. He interprets the dream, and he tells Pharaoh from the very beginning, he said, you know, it's not me that can interpret it, but God. God's going to interpret your dream, and it's going to be fine. God gave him the wisdom to do that. God also gave him the wisdom and the insight to tell Pharaoh, said, listen, you better assign somebody to take care of these 7 plenteous years and store it up, because there's going to be 7 lean years, and you need to have an overseer. I mean, this is big time stuff. This is not just, well, here's the interpretation, let's see what happens. He's like, listen, the Lord doubled it. God showed it to you twice. It's surely going to come to pass. You better get on the stick, and you better heed his warning, and you better take care of this. And, you know, Pharaoh's kind of wondering what he's going to do, and he looks, and Joseph's standing right there in front of him. He says, you're the man. Matter of fact, I mean, to me, I think it's just amazing. I mean, not only are you the man, I mean, you're the number 2 man. I mean, you didn't just, you go work for George over here, because now George is a pretty smart fella, and you instruct him what to do. He said, no, Joseph, listen, I'm going to make you number 2. There's only going to be one person in this land greater than you, and that's me, Pharaoh. But you're going to ride number 2. If people's going to bow when you come into the street at your order, people can be executed. People better do what they say, or they can be killed. I mean, you're the man. Well, as we read on then, and something's happening here in the background. And this is why I really want to talk about this morning, because it's just amazing that during this time, Joseph's really kind of the first one that's there out of Israel, becoming a nation and building up a large amount of people and multiplying in Egypt. But now the famine has waxed so great the last week or two that we studied it, that here comes Jacob, sends his children down, the boys, the brothers, and they go down to Egypt. And again, I'm not going to repeat our same lesson, and I guess I have, but they go down there to buy corn. And I love this. I mean, listen, this is the number 2 guy of Pharaoh. I mean, this is him. I mean, this is vice president. This is whatever you want to call it, a prince. I mean, he's number 2. He not only is in charge of storing the corn, and it gets so great that he can't even number it anymore, but he's the one that sells it. He says, listen, we're not just going to give a free handout here. We're going to sell this stuff. We're going to continue to be a great place in Egypt here. We're going to sell it. And listen, he's the guy that you go to see to buy it. I mean, he ain't even appointed somebody to do that. I mean, everybody in Egypt but Pharaoh bows to Joseph, but yet he's the guy you got to go see to buy corn. I mean, that is tremendous. So guess what? His brothers, and I mean, God made this man, Joseph, that's a picture of himself, of Jesus. But I mean, everything is set and staged for a reason, because when Joseph's brothers come, they don't go see George or John or whoever, man. They got to see Joseph to buy corn. And Joseph recognizes them, that they're his brothers. And remember, we go through that whole story. So now they've went back and they've told their father, they run out of corn again that they bought down in Egypt, but they didn't really buy it because Joseph gave it to them because they had their money. So now they're really going crazy, because now they're going to be in trouble. So their daddy sent them back down there. And now Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. He's inquired about his father. And now his father's about to die. And he's handing out these blessings. And now we see in chapter 50 that they've came down. Jacob, and I think it's about 70 in his household, has came down to Egypt, okay? Because there's corn in Egypt. Joseph's number 2 in charge. I mean, why wouldn't you do that? And they came down. Now notice something happens here, that because he's came down to Egypt, watch, Joseph's still in power. Verse 2. And Joseph commanded his servants, and this is in chapter 50, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel. And the days were fulfilled for him, for so are fulfilled the days of those that are embalmed. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days, so about 70 days. And when the days of his mourning were past, Joseph spake unto the house of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found grace in your eyes, speak, I pray you, in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Lo, I die in my grave which I have digged for me in the land of Canaan. There shalt thou bury me. Now therefore let me go up, I pray thee, and bury my father, that I will come again. And Pharaoh said, Go up and bury thy father, according as he made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father, verse 7, and him went all the servants of Pharaoh and the elders of the house and all the elders of the land of Egypt. So, we said all that to get to the point here that, Joseph's still very, very powerful in the land of Egypt. I mean, he's so powerful that he's like, well, there we don't have a lot to offer. We can pour a few spices on them, but man, in Egypt, we're technologically advanced here. I mean, we're going to bomb Dad, and we're going to try this new thing out on him or whatever, and we're going to embalm him. And I mean, he still shows respect for Pharaoh. He said, listen, my father had a kind of a dying wish that I would take him back and bury him there in Canaan, and he's already dug a grave. and I'd like to do that. And Pharaoh, I mean, they've got a relationship here. I mean, this is his number 2 guy. I mean, not only has the dreams came true, but he's sustained the land. And man, it's like, yeah, Joseph, go. Take care. Take everybody with you. I mean, can you imagine that funeral procession? I mean, it's like here comes all the servants of Pharaoh and all of Jacob's house. And man, they're going to bury his dad. So the relationship's still tight-knit. Now, Joseph's brothers, just to throw this in for an extra 2 cents, Joseph's brothers are worried now that their daddy's been buried. Says, boy, now Joseph's still in power. Dad's buried. And man, Joseph can kind of come back here and hold all this against us. Now, that's how pressing their sin or their act or their ruse or they've lived with this guilt of what they did with Joseph their whole life. And now it's even come back up in chapter number 50. It says in verse 15, and when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us and will certainly requite us the evil which we did unto him. So they were worried about it. So they sent messengers to him. And look at verse 20. Joseph has never changed his stance, not one time. Not after his father died, not when he rose to power, not when he was in the prison, not when he was in the palace. Verse 20, but as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, so now we kind of close those curtains. We've opened up a new set again in verse 22. It says, and Joseph dwelled in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. So it's laying a new foundation for us here. It's saying, listen, all right, we've closed all this stuff out. Jacob, Israel, he's been buried in Canaan. Joseph dwelt in Egypt. They've lived in Egypt, happily ever after, if you will, and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. And of course, verse 24, and Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of this land unto the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so what he's talking about here, he's like, listen, we're down here, but he said, listen, surely God's going to show up. I mean, because see, so now we fast forwarded to a point to where they weren't in Egypt except for Joseph. Now they're in Egypt. They're living there. They're thriving there because Joseph's number 2 man to Pharaoh. They're thriving there. But he said he still remembered God's promise. And again, I think that shows you something about Joseph's character, is he don't say, listen, y'all just live happily ever after. Man, I've set you up now for life. You got to trust in Pharaoh's house. I mean, you know, man, I've set you up. He said, no. He said, listen, God still ain't changed his plan. He still ain't changed his mind. He said, God's going to visit you. He's going to bring you out of this place. He's going to give you the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. That's what he's trying to tell them. He said, listen, you're not just going to live happily ever after here on your trust fund I've set up for you and the corn we've got stored. He said, man, God's going to get you out of here. He's going to give you what he promised. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, verse 25, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. Now, I don't know how far we get to go on. Like I said, I really don't know. But don't ever underline that in your Bible, because if you remember, and I'll just go ahead and tell you, and if we keep going, I'll remind you of it later. But when Israel got out of Egypt that night, there's a sentence in there that refers right back to this. They carried the bones of Joseph with them as they left. They honored that. So that's a real important sentence there. So he said, listen, he said, when you leave, he said, you carry my bones out of here. So I'm going to be buried here, but I want you to take my bones with you when you go. So Joseph died, verse 26, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So he's told them, he's given them some direction. He said, it's fine if I'm in a coffin in Egypt here, but when God gets you out of here, here's an important fact. You pass this on to the next generation. And I think this bleeds into what I wanted to finish with this morning, is he said, this is so important to me that you pass this along to the next generation. So, you know, if he told it to my dad or my dad's dad, and then my dad told me, and then it's my job to tell Pacer, and I don't know when it's going to happen, but listen, when it does, you take Joseph's bones and you carry them out of here. We don't know how it's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know what's going to take place, but whenever you do, you better not forget my bones. You better take them with you. But I'm going to be buried in a coffin. And we know from the Bible that they didn't forget. It was so important to them that they passed it down to somebody that remembered and said, hey, we better get them bones and take them with us when we go. And, you know, again, I hope we get to go over that story later on. But here's why I said that. Because for whatever reason, now we've closed the pages of Genesis and we've opened up this new book of the Bible called Exodus. And down in verse number, it starts out by going through the names of Israel and Egypt. In verse 1 of chapter 1 and on down 2, 3, 4, and 5, it gets down to verse 6, says, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. So the Bible starts out, and I really do try to, you know, I think sometimes maybe a little too much, try to dramatize some of this because the Bible really is trying to tell you something here. It's saying, listen, I want you to know, man, this is a great story you've read through and studied and preached and taught in Sunday school and books have been wrote about. But listen, that chapter's changed now. Joseph's died and his brethren and all that generation. So they've died. And you say, well, what's so important about that? Well, it goes on. Verse 7, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied. I wonder why they did that. Well, because God said they was going to. He told Abraham, you're going to be as the stars and going to be as the sand of the sea. Can you number the sand? Well, guess what? Right here you're seeing it in one verse. You're seeing them multiply. They're increasing abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. I mean, think, this is God writing this, so he wants you to understand that when he told Abraham that he wasn't kidding. That, hey, you're going to have children as the sand of the sea. And man, the sand, you can pick up a fistful of sand and there's probably millions of pieces. So in one verse, God said, listen, I'm making this thing happen. It says, and the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now here's the sad part, because we've seen that Israel's going to do their part, but it says, and now, verse 8, there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And man, I mean, you've heard stuff preached about that, lessons, books, whatever. But, I mean, think about everything, and I mean, I really wanted to try to tell that story this morning. Everything up to this point. I mean, Joseph was the man that rode number 2 to the man. I mean, this is a great story. I mean, listen, we track our people and our generations and our ancestry, and man, most of them don't do nothing. But man, we want to know all about them. I mean, they don't do nothing. Great. I mean, there are probably no presidents. There's no, I mean, you know, I don't know. Maybe there is no kings, no nothing. I mean, they just work and they die and then another one comes on. And man, we track that stuff and we're eat up with it and got pictures in our house. And I mean, here's a story for you. That there was 7 years of plenty in the land of Egypt. And man, the old Pharaoh, he dreamed a dream and all this happened. And he rose up this Joseph out of prison. And man, now that's a story. And man, they kept so much and they sold and they got plenty out of it. And man, they survived the next 7 years of famine. Now that's a story. But there arose up a king, a new Pharaoh, a new king that didn't even know Joseph. Man, they didn't care about that. They didn't care about God. I think that's the other thing you can address out of this, that all the way through here, God was in the forefront of Joseph's talk, of his speech, of what he did and how he performed what he did. And God led him all the way. And, you know, even Pharaoh acknowledged that multiple times. He even acknowledged it as far as saying, listen, if your daddy wants to be buried in Canaan, man, you go do it. He acknowledged that. But notice here, it don't say that there rose up another king that didn't know God. It rose up a king that didn't know Joseph. And this crowd wasn't even, they didn't want nothing to do with God. And although he respected Joseph's God, it still wasn't his God. And I think that that's and as you look on here now, there arose up this king that don't even know Joseph. And so now the stage is set. So the Bible up to this point now, we started with Joseph. 70-some people in Jacob or Israel's family now has went here. And now the Bible has really fast forwarded things. It said, all right, now these people, after these blessings, and man, some years have passed because Joseph's died, the brethren's died, his brothers, but these people are multiplying. They're increasing exceedingly. That's the Bible's words. They're growing. So now the stage is set that you've got all these Israelites now in a land of Egypt where they don't belong. And watch this. It says, verse number 9, and he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. You know, that's really kind of the first time that somebody really recognizes them as a nation, if you will, is right there. Because watch what he says, this new king, this new Pharaoh over Egypt. He says, behold, the people of the children of Israel. So these people of Israel are more and mightier than we. That's pretty much, they've established them as a nation right there. Man, they're more mightier than we are. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also into our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. So what he's saying, everybody in that day, man, they were all scared of their own shadow. And they're like, these people's getting so big and so mighty that if one enemy comes in and gets them on their side, man, we're done. I'm going to be the first Pharaoh in history to lose all this. And so he says we can't do it. So verse 11, therefore, so because of that, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. Verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter and with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And that just means with hardness. So, they made it rough on them. And we're going to stop there this week. But, so now the stage is set. And I think that's what I like. Sometimes I think when we study about Egypt and stuff, we kind of forget how we got there. And this morning I feel like we saw that. But, there's one thing that it's like, well, what does all this mean to us? This is cool stories and all, but thank goodness, I probably won't ever even go to Egypt, so what's all this mean to us? The one thing we can learn from this is very simple, but it's very true, and it still holds true today, that over the last several months, a couple years or whatever, we've went through the entire book of Genesis. Well, we've seen great people come and go. We've seen Adam. We learned about Adam and Eve and Noah. I'll go back that far. And then we started seeing patriarchs like Abraham, the story of Isaac. We've looked this last few weeks of Jacob. God changed some of their names and changed Jacob's to Israel. And now we studied the life of Joseph, a type of Christ. But you know what we saw over the last several months? Is all those folks, they were great. They're patriarchs. You know their name to this day. But they died. They They were buried. But God is the only constant that's always continued through every story. He's never changed. He's never died. He's never went away. He's been faithful. And although these great patriarchs has come and went, and we saw a lot of them die and a lot of them be great people, but they've died, but God has just carried on and kept marching on forward. And the same holds true today. I mean, with today, with presidents, with kings, with queens, and, there's never been a monarch in history lived 70 years and everybody's been celebrating the queen. But, man, our God, he's been around a lot longer than that, and he's still on the throne. He's still going strong today as well. And that's so important for us to understand that God is the one that he's just keep on marching on. He's still in charge. And there might be a Pharaoh that's rose that don't know Joseph, but boy, we know here in the coming weeks that God's going to show up in a mighty way, and he's going to get his people out of Egypt. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, your many blessings. Thank you for our time together this morning.